A couple of years ago, I got to visit the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It was a powerful experience that communicated through words and pictures and artifacts the horrible scope of what was perpetrated by the Nazi regime against the people of Europe during the Second World War. That museum bears witness to millions of people who were murdered in the Holocaust. The largest percentage were Jews, but among the others targeted by the Nazis were the Romani people, commonly known as gypsies, Poles, Slavs, the mentally and physically handicapped, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, political dissidents, and even dissenting pastors. There's so much to see there, and I'm sure that each person is affected by something different. But the thing I remember most were the shoes. As I was making my way from one exhibit to the next, I turned a corner, and there, stretched out before me for about 30 or 40 feet alongside the pathway, were shoes. Tens of thousands of shoes. Work boots, dress shoes, women's pumps with heels, and some that were clearly children's shoes. They had been taken from men and women and children who had been interned at the Majdanek and Auschwitz concentration camps. Crumpled, worn, dusty. They had begun to come apart at the seams, and the leather had begun to deteriorate. The shoes had become flattened and hard, the way that old leather shoes will do once they've been laying in the back of a closet for a long time. As I stood there, overwhelmed by the sight, I began to think about the people who had worn those shoes and of the places that they had been. They had walked to work and to school each day, sometimes in rain and snow. They had danced waltzes, run to pick up crying children. They had carried their wearers to worship and to market, to weddings and to funerals and school plays. They had traversed construction sites and homes and jogged alongside little boys and girls learning to ride their bicycles for the first time, and perhaps had even spent a few evenings propped up on an ottoman or a coffee table after 1,000 long days of work. Every pair of those shoes represented a life lived, and the scope of the tragedy which had ultimately brought them to that place became more real for me. I think of that experience in the Holocaust Museum now as I read Ezekiel's vision of being led by the Spirit of God through a wide valley filled with dry bones. These are not bodies that Ezekiel sees. Bodies have flesh and blood in them, and in the Hebrew tradition, life was in the blood. That's why you weren't supposed to eat an animal with its blood. That's why so many sacrificial rites involved splashing the blood of the sacrificed animal on the altar or on the worshipers. Blood was sacred. But there's no blood here, no flesh. These are bones, the remains of bodies that had long since died and been left to rot and decompose. These bones have been picked clean by scavengers and have been bleached dry in the sun. They bear no resemblance to living, breathing people. They are completely devoid of life. Like the shoes, by their sheer numbers, these bones bear mute testimony to death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. This valley is not a real place, and what Ezekiel sees is a vision from God. But this wide valley of desolation is significant because it represents for Ezekiel the state of his people. It stands as a symbol of the complete and utter destruction of Israel and the place of irreversible desolation in which the people find themselves. To fully understand, you have to remember where Israel was at the time of Ezekiel's vision and where they've been. Israel's self-identity as a nation is found in its story. It's a story that stretches back to God's promise to Abraham and Sarah of descendants as numerous as the grains of sand on a beach or the stars in the sky. It's a story of those descendants being rescued from slavery in Egypt and being delivered through the wilderness, led by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. It's a story of the parting of the Red Sea and the safe passage of the people through it, a story of God's miraculous provision in the wilderness of food and water, of the giving of laws and the merciful protection and guidance into a new home, a land promised to Abraham generations before. It is a story of Israel's growth and prosperity. Under David and his son Solomon, Israel knew greater political, military, and economic power than at any other time in its history. This story was, for the people, evidence of God's power and might and superiority over all other gods, and it was evidence that as the chosen people of God, they had nothing to fear. But then the nation split, and the northern kingdom was swept away by the Assyrians and ceased to be a political entity. And nearly 2 centuries after that, the remaining southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by Babylon. Jerusalem was leveled. The temple of Solomon, the symbol of God's very presence amongst the people, was desecrated. And many of the people were carried away to exile in Babylon. The story had changed. The identity of the chosen people had been crippled. How could all that they had believed about their God and their relationship to their God be true if the godless Assyrians and Babylonians had seemingly been able to defeat their God and take away or destroy all that God had given them? The psalmist captures some of this hopeless and desolate spirit of hopelessness and desolation experienced by the Israelites after that final conquest of Judah. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." But how could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? It's in the midst of this hopelessness and desolation that God shows Ezekiel a vision of this valley of dry, dusty, and lifeless bones. And God speaks to Ezekiel and says, "Mortal, can these bones live?" And I love that God calls Ezekiel mortal. From the very beginning, God is clear of what Ezekiel's role is in this vision. Ezekiel is a mortal, as are we. And while mortals can cause death and destruction and desolation, they cannot restore a scene such as this one to life, as God is about to do. And so God speaks to Ezekiel and says, "Mortal, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel says, "Oh God, you know." And then and there, amidst the lifelessness, amidst the hopelessness, amidst the valley of dry and dusty desolation, God restores life. The bones rattle and clack together, bone to bone, until skeletons are formed. And then they're connected by sinews and covered with muscle and skin, but there's no life in them yet. And God tells Ezekiel, "Prophesy to the winds." And we remember that the Hebrew word for wind is the same as the word for spirit. And we get the implication that God's Spirit is active, and the winds blow, and the breath of life is breathed into these newly reconstituted bodies, restoring the people to life, and there they stand, a nation, reconstituted from the rubble. And God speaks again to Ezekiel, saying, "Mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely. But I will put my Spirit within you, and you shall live." To those who had witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem, who had been taken forcibly from their homes and their livelihoods, and then been deported to a foreign land against their will, to those who believed that with exile in a foreign land came physical separation from God, Ezekiel's message of hope for the future might have sounded as unlikely as did his vision of life in the valley of total desolation. But within a half a century, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and Cyrus the Great began allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem, effectively ending their exile and returning them to the land of promise, just like Ezekiel said. I doubt very many of us read Ezekiel very often, and most of us would have a hard time with Ezekiel's interpretation of the destruction of people and homes as God's acting to punish sinfulness. We affirm, though, that when bad things happen, God is with us through them, not actively making those bad things happen as a form of punishment. But we also affirm that God allows us to experience the consequences of our actions. And the Jews in Israel and Judah tried to resist military and political powers greater than themselves and did experience the tragic consequences of that. But we also hear good news in Ezekiel. Good news in the words that God remained faithful to Israel, that God made a promise to restore life where once there had been only death, that not only does God have the power to bring life from preposterously bleak circumstances, but that God is willing to do so, and in that we can have hope. I read the Columbus Dispatch just about every day. And whether you read a daily paper or get your news from the web or the evening news broadcasts, it's hard to avoid reports that paint a rather bleak picture of our world. It was just a few days ago that there was a story about two children that were taken to visit their father, interestingly enough, who lived in Israel. And within hours of their arrival, their father brutally murdered them. We hear of violent acts committed in schools and the workplace, where innocent men, women, and children are senselessly murdered. We hear of the poor being forced to choose between medicine and food and rent. We see people marginalized and persecuted because of their religion or their sexual orientation or their immigration status. Armed conflicts rage today in Syria and Iraq. Terrorism threatens the lives of the innocents in places like Nigeria and Afghanistan. Poverty and lack of access to basic needs like clean water and food and medicine threaten millions of people all over the world. I see these things in my morning newspaper and I think, well, I really should stop reading the morning newspaper. But I also remember that long hallway filled with shoes. And I remember Ezekiel standing in that wide valley filled with bones. And I hear the word of God asking, "Mortal, can these bones live? Can this world so fraught with sin and desolation be redeemed and made whole?" Oh God, you know. On the seal of my home state of South Carolina is the state motto, Dum Spiro, Spero. It is a Latin phrase which translates to, "While I breathe, I hope." In the words and vision of the prophet Ezekiel, we find reassurance that while human sin and evil are real, and while it can be easy for us to be overwhelmed by the vastness of it, God has already begun acting to redeem this world and to make it whole. Across the years, we hear the voice of Ezekiel reminding us that God brings light to the dark places and life to the dead places. In this, we can be confident. In this, we can hope. And because we have hope in God's desire and ability to bring life, we can seek to be a part of that living, and we can be bearers of that life-giving good news into the world. Dum Spiro, Spero. While I breathe, I hope. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come.